could back up or elevate to, I don't know, 10,000 feet above your life and look at it, it looks so much different. You would see the big high points and maybe you could see the results of some low points. But one of the crazy things, we're in this series called The Shadow King. One of the interesting parts is what's in the shadows. That you can see the bright spots, you can see the dark spots, but what's in the little gray areas, the shadows. And today we're going to look at some stuff in Scripture that maybe would be brand new to some of you, that gets lost with all the superhero moments in the life of David, or some of the OMG moments, I can't believe that happened in his life. And then sometimes right in the edges, in the shadows of that, we find that's where life unfolds. It's often where we find the coolest parts of life, the most meaningful parts of life. Just because it's not on the highlight reel or the low light reel doesn't mean it's not real. And so today is going to be just right in the messy middle of life to watch how some backstory plays out. I think it'll be fun. Jeremy's going to lead us through that, introduce you to some new people in Scripture, and hopefully you'll relate to some of it this morning. So here we go.
So David is probably the most famous or popular character in Scripture other than maybe Jesus. There's more written about David than pretty much anyone. We have most of his story kind of chronicled hell for us in 1 Samuel. He's kind of the biographer for David, and you might be familiar with some of his story. If you were with us last week, we talked about one of the really high points in David's story, and that's David as this victorious David. But maybe you're more familiar with King David. King David was a big part of his story too. But there was a story in between victorious David with Goliath and King David. Somewhere sandwiched in the middle was fugitive David. Now you got to imagine what happens in this story, a little bit of historical backstory. So David defeats Goliath, and man, he gets a ton of fans. But one of his fans is not King Saul, the guy who really is in charge of the kingdom of Israel. He's the king, and he sees David getting tons and tons of fanfare and attention, and he becomes very jealous. The story kind of explodes over a period of time, and man, what happens next is basically David gets pushed out of the kingdom and is a fugitive from justice, and Saul is chasing him down. Now, like I said, he's got lots of fans. So he's about 600 men and their families that are kind of his band of fugitives from justice, right? From the hands of Saul anyways. And so they're out kind of in the mess of it all. Today, we're going to look at some stories, or at least one story from David's story that matters a ton to you and me. And it's really about how to deal with mean people. Now, you might imagine, man, that I would be talking about Saul, because Saul is unbelievably mean to David. He tries to kill him and does all kinds of stuff. But I think there's a story that tells us even more about how you and I, how we can, in real life, deal with mean people than just his interactions with Saul. There's a little bit more obscure story, but before we get there, I want to remind us of the rules of dealing with people. You have a rule that you probably learned when you were a kid. It's the golden rule. You may have learned it as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But the way I kind of would simplify it is this: treat others the way you want to be treated. That's the golden rule, right? That's the rule that we want to live by. That's the rule we tell our kids. But over time in our life, once you've been hurt for a little while, once you've gone through some pain and you've kind of tried to treat others kindly and they haven't treated you, you kind of find this new rhythm or this new way of doing things kind of coming up inside of you. And I think of it as like the iron rule. If the golden rule is treat others the way you want to be treated, then the iron rule is treat others the way they treat you, right? They do something bad to you and you do what you can to get even with them. That's the iron rule. And the iron rule is one of those problems that we have in our life. Because what the iron rule is mean people getting a measure or a little bit of control over your life. I don't know about you, but I don't want mean people to have any control over my life. I don't want them to control me. I don't want them to control the outcomes of my life. I don't want them to control the direction. But when they begin to play this game and they do something mean to you, and then you reciprocate, aren't they really just controlling you? When we were kids, we learned the golden rule. When we were older, we learned the iron rule. But what if there was another rule? What if there was another way to handle things rather than just the predictable way of you do something wrong to me, I do something wrong to get even? I think we see that rule, this possibility in one of David's maybe lower points of his life. He's the king, right? He's got great things going for him in his future, and he's got great things going for him in his past. But in this kind of messy middle where we usually live, he's somewhere between the moments of greatness, and he has this not so great moment, or well, almost he has this not so great moment. It starts in verse 2 and 3. I want you to check this out. There was a wealthy man from Maon who owned property near the town of Carmel. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing time. The man's name was Nabal, and his wife Abigail was a sensible and beautiful woman. But Nabal, a descendant of Caleb, was crude and mean in all his dealings. Now, to people like us, right, the idea of having 1,000 goats, like you're like, wow, that just seems like a lot of trouble, right? That doesn't mean that we have anything resourceful or any value, but he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. Imagine that, like dozens of garages full of cars. Like this man Nabal was filthy rich. He was super, super rich. And what the Bible's telling us in this thing is it was shearing time. Shearing time is an interesting and like really festive time for this culture because it's when the rich people who have more goats or more sheep would shear the sheep and then sell the wool off or sell the meat and all that kind of different things off to other people, and the rich would get richer. You see what happens, right? This is the time of year when kind of he gets to see all of the money come in from all of his labor. So he's got tons of income, and it's a time of celebration. His whole household is throwing parties because the rich have gotten richer. The story kind of goes on to talk about Nabal and his story with David in verses 4 through 9. When David heard Nabal was shearing sheep, he sent 10 of his young men to Carmel with a message for Nabal. Peace and prosperity to you, your family, and everything you own. I am told that it's sheep shearing time. While your shepherds stayed among us near Carmel, we never harmed them, and nothing was ever stolen from them. Ask your own men, and they will tell you it's true. So would you be kind to us, since we have come to you at a time of celebration? Please share with us any provisions you might have on hand, and with us and with your friend David. Now here's what's going on. Like there was a time when these men were out raising and herding sheep out in an area where David and his 600 men were. And during that time, David didn't steal anything from him, and he didn't let other people steal from him. And so he kind of protected Nabal's property in this period of time. And so what David is saying, hey, I'm coming to you at a time of celebration, a time of abundance and extra in your life. And we've done some really good things for you, and we could really use a hand. Would you give us a hand? So he asked this of Nabal, and the next verse says, David's young men gave this message to Nabal in David's name, and they waited for a reply. And they waited, and they waited for a while before their reply came back. And then Nabal's reply says, who is this fellow David? Nabal sheared at his young men. Who does this son of Jesse think he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters. Should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where, right? You see what he's doing? He knows exactly who David is. David has a reputation. They know full well that there's 600 men encamped and all their families. He knows full well he's in the region. He knows full well that he didn't take anything from him. But you see this arrogance that Nabal says? I mean, it says earlier in the passage that he's a crude and kind of just mean human being, not a good person. And he's like, who is this son of Jesse? Clearly, David didn't send word that he was the son of Jesse. He's like, who is this son of Jesse? He's a nobody. And then he goes, should I give this stuff to some outlaw who comes in from, I don't know, who you say again? Where'd you say you were from? Like he just goes through this part of just disdain and meanness to David. So David's young men returned and told him what Nabal said. And David's reaction was fierce. Don't make any joke about it. I mean, like, it's a big deal how fierce it was. He says, get your own swords, right? David's men, and it was David's reply, and he strapped on his own. And then the 400 men started off with David, and 200 remained behind to guard their equipment. That's a big deal. There's a lot of little detail in there that's not necessary. He says, get your swords. But then the author, Samuel, kind of includes this almost parenthetical phrase, was David's reply as he strapped on his own sword. Man, that's a big deal, because I think what Samuel's doing is just kind of giving us a little bit of indication of this tension that is within David at this very moment. Remember last week we talked about David defeating Goliath, one of the highest points in his life, where he recognized that the giant that was in front of him was nothing compared to the giant that was behind him. God was behind him and Goliath was in front of him. And he said, who stands against the armies of the Lord? And that's a crazy time. And then Samuel, in just a few chapters later, 7 or 8 chapters later, includes this statement, and he strapped on his own sword. Where did David get his sword? If you rewind just a few chapters back to like 21, you'll find out that David got his sword from a priest, and it was Goliath's sword. So on his very back, he handles and holds the reminder that he defeated Goliath with his own sword, not by his strength, but by the power of God. And here is David rallying, right? Here's David just focusing his anger. Here's David building up a head of steam. You ever had one of those heads of steam in your life? I have, right? You get angry, somebody does something to hurt you, and you just kind of build up this tension, and you rehearse it, and you go over it, and the next thing you know, you're fired up and angry, furious, ready to exact revenge. And that's exactly what David does. Down in verse 21, it says, David had just been saying, a lot of good it did us to help this fellow. We protected his flocks in the wilderness, and nothing he owned was lost or stolen, but he repaid me evil for good. May God strike me and kill me, even if one man of his household is still alive tomorrow morning. He was furious, right? He was fired up more than anybody should be fired up, right? He's like, I tried to do something good, and here's this man repaying evil for good. And that's really the tension, isn't it? Like, what's crazy about it is when you put those two side by side, you realize pretty quickly that Nabal was acting in a way that repaid evil for good. And then David's reaction was to repay evil for evil. Nabal was acting maniacally, right? And David was acting predictably. And Nabal's poor actions, right, his choice to repay evil for good, was really exacting control over David, wasn't it? That's exactly what happens when we yield control. When we yield control back to the person, we say, you get to define this game. And that is an important, vital piece for us to get. That when we experience that kind of pain in our life, mean people can gain a measure of control over our lives if we choose to play their game. That's the big if, isn't it? And that's the choice that you and I have to make. If we're going to play their game, then they get some level of control. I was thinking that if they make us feel like we have to do something to get even with them, don't they? They do something to us and it makes us feel, they get enough control over our life to make us feel like we need to do something to get even with them. But what happens when we get even? You know what it does? It makes us like a person that we don't even like. All we do when we get even with somebody is it makes us like a person that we don't even like. Like, why would I want to be even or like somebody that I don't even like? That's what's crazy. Now here, I want to give you just a little bit of a kind of a meanwhile. Like one of those flashbacks that meanwhile back at camp, right? Or meanwhile back at the house. That's what's going on in the next couple of verses. In verse 14, just jumping back kind of to the middle of this story, it says this. Meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants went to Abigail and told her, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed insults at them. These men have been very good to us, and we never suffered harm from them. Nothing was stolen from us the whole time that they were with us. In fact, day and night, They were like a wall of protection to us and the sheep. Abigail wasted no time, just jumping down a couple of verses. She quickly gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins full of wine, 5 sheep who had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 fig cakes. She packed them on donkeys and said to her servants, "Go ahead and I will follow you shortly." But she didn't tell her husband Nabal what she was doing. You've heard of food trucks, right? Well, these were food donkeys. She packed them full of resources because she knew that things were about to get really tense between her horrible, mean husband and David, who felt like he had to get even. And there was something bad brewing that wasn't going to be great. And so she decided that she was going to do something different. Nabal was acting maniacal. David was acting predictable. And Abigail chooses to step in and do something different. That's really the thing that you and I have to get today. What's important about this is when we begin to choose between the way they act and the way we act, we give them control. And when we give them control, it pushes us down where we can only see one option, and that is to act predictably. But there's more to the story. There's more possibility for your life than just getting even and becoming like somebody that you don't even like. What happens next is powerful. And I want you to know something that's really important here, especially for you ladies, because what happens here is that Abigail talks to David like he is already the man that she thinks he is. Now, I want to say that again because I want us to get that. Abigail talks to David like he's already the man that she believes she is. And ladies, I want you to know this. That works on us every single time, even when we know what you're doing. When you begin to believe in us, when you begin to talk to us like we're the men that we already think, that you already think we are, and you believe in our future, it works on us every time. It works on her life. Let me just give you a little example of it in my own life. Sheila and I watched the show Ted Lasso. Now, I love Ted Lasso. I think it's a great show. It's fun to watch. The language is terrible and there's some bad content. I'm not saying everybody should watch it, but it's a hilarious show. And it comes out weekly on Apple TV+. And so every Friday when it comes out, we're like anxious to watch it. But this week, Sheila was out of town for a couple of days. She took our girls over to Nashville to have some mom and daughter time. You know, our kids are getting older. And I told her, I texted her, well, let me just read it to you. I said, "I really hate that you're going to be out of town while I watch Ted Lasso on Friday." And she texted back, "Actually, I really hate that since I'm going to be out of town and you are such a great, kind, and loving husband, always putting my needs before your own, you will wait to watch the show until I've gotten home on Saturday night. I can't see even one drip of selfishness into you." So you know what I said? Well played. You know why? Because it works on us, right? It works on us every time when you believe in who we are. And it works on everybody. Everybody wants somebody to believe in them. Everybody wants somebody to believe that they can be a better version of themselves. Abigail believed that for David. "Now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, since the Lord has kept you from murdering and taking vengeance into your own hands, let all your enemies and those who try to harm you be as cursed as Nabal is." Look at what she says in that. She says, "Since the Lord has kept you." It's already past tense, isn't it? She's like, the Lord has kept you, right? The Lord has stopped you. The Lord has kept you from doing this terribly wrong thing. David's like, "He has?" She's like, "He has. He absolutely has." And David begins to believe what Abigail believes for him. And what's crazy about it is she says, "May the Lord pay this vengeance. May you trust God that he will take care of this." A couple verses later, she says this, "Even when you are chased by the one who seeks to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch. But the lives of your enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling." Do you see what she's doing? She's reminding him of how great a man he already is in her mind. She's saying, "You've already done this." And then she reminds him, "Your enemies will be shot down like stones from a sling." Nobody else would really value that statement as much as David would. because he remembers it wasn't that many years ago that he was standing over the body of Goliath that he just knocked down with a smooth stone that he found in this riverbed, waiting for him to pick it up and use it because God was behind him. What Abigail was doing was reminding him that you don't have to play the mean people game. You don't have to get funneled down into this iron rule. You don't have to choose between being maniacal or being predictable. What Abigail was trying to convince David was that there is another way. The question that you and I have to ask, the question you and I have to answer when we're dealing with mean people, when we're dealing with tough situations like this, is understanding it this way. There'll be a day, right? Maybe it's a day or a week or a month or a year. But all of the circumstances that go into this, all the way that you feel, all the way the interactions, all the text messaging back and forth, all the anger, all the maliciousness, all of that is going to be reduced down to a story that you're going to tell. You're going to tell this story about how you dealt with a mean person to maybe your kids or your grandkids. You're going to tell it to your friends, or your friends are going to tell it about you. Let me ask you this question. When the situation you're dealing with right now is reduced one day to a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to say? Do you want to weigh out those options? Do you want to be the kind of person who says, you know what, they did something mean to me and I got even with them. I became like a person that I didn't even like, right? I did something back to them and they felt like they had to do something back to me. And the predictable spiral just kept going down. Or do you want to tell a story to your kids, your grandkids, your friends, your spouse? Do you want to tell a story where you said, you know what, I saw that they treated me that way. They offered evil for good, and I instead offered evil for evil. Or do you want to say, you know what, I chose Abigail's way? And that's really what happened, wasn't it? Abigail put a third option on the table. Nabal tried to repay evil for good and was acting maniacal. David, on the other hand, tried to repay evil for evil and was acting predictably. But Abigail stepped in, sensible and intelligent, and said, why don't you repay good for evil? She was acting remarkable. When this whole thing is reduced to a story that you tell your friends and your family, do you want to be predictable or remarkable? I don't know about you, but I want to be remarkable. I want to be the kind of person who acts remarkably and does things differently, because I don't want to be like or even with someone that I don't even like. So the story goes on. And it says this in the next couple of verses, in verses 30 and 31. It says, when the Lord had done all he promised, and you are made the leader of Israel, don't let this blemish be on your record, and then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And when the Lord has done these great things for you, please remember me, your servant Abigail. And he responds to her and says, you're right. I'm glad you interrupted me. I'm glad you interrupted and pulled the plug on this head of steam I was building, because I was going to run in and slaughter everybody. But since you've interrupted me and you've spoken remarkably, I'm going to choose to do something different. When Abigail arrived home, verse 36, she found that Nabal was throwing a big party, and he was celebrating like a king. He was very drunk. So she didn't tell him anything about her meeting with David until the dawn the next day. In the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him what had happened. As a result, he had a stroke, and he lay paralyzed on his bed like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. Man, that's a killer ending, really, isn't it? I mean, David is asking for this man to repay him for the good he's done. Nabal says, I will repay evil for good. David gets furious, right? He falls into the pit of discussion with Nabal, and he winds up saying, I'm going to repay evil for evil. And Abigail interrupts it and acts remarkably and says, what if you repaid good for evil? David listens to her, takes a step back, lets the head of steam settle, and God is the vengeance. God brings everything to justice. I'm just reminded of Romans 8:28. It's an easy verse to remember. It goes like this: all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I want you to know something. that if you're a follower of Jesus, there is another way. You don't have to get stuck in the maniacal or predictable discussion. You can choose by the power of God inside of you to become and to respond in a remarkable way. But if you're not there yet, and this whole Jesus, God, church thing is not your story, I want you to know something, that you can have that too. That can be something that is real and true inside of your life. And it begins by beginning to give your life to Jesus. Don't ask Jesus into your life. Give your life to him. And it's very simple. It's just really saying, God, I realize that I've done things the wrong way, and I want to give my life to you. It's the most important decision you'll ever make, and we want to know about it. If you're here today and you're going, man, I really do want to find a way to be remarkable in my life, then I want to know that if you started a relationship with Jesus today, would you please let me know? You can email me at jeremy@ourjourney.com, or you can fill out the connection card and just check on there that you want to begin a relationship with Jesus Christ. Go to ourjourney.news and fill out the connection card and just check that box that says, I want to begin a relationship with Jesus. There are some ups and downs in life. There are things that go really well, things that don't go so well, some really poor decisions. We'll talk about some of those in David's life later. But today, you can act remarkable, and David's a good example of it. Join us next week for part 3 of The Shadow King.